Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Ever try explaining the internet to someone who, well, remembers life before dial-up?
Right, like trying to explain memes to your grandparent.
Exactly. And that's kind of what it's like talking about the end of the Cold War, right?
It really is. Full of assumptions, these big pronouncements about winners and losers.
Yeah, and sometimes it feels like we skip over the nuances, the hows, and the whys. But you've brought us a really intriguing angle for this deep dive, going back to the 1980s.
Ah, the 80s.
To see if this decade was, well, was it just setting the stage for the fall of the Soviet Union, or did it actually cause it?
And what a decade it was, right? We're talking shoulder pads, synth pop.
Big hair. Don't forget the big hair.
Oh, absolutely. But also enough geopolitical tension to make a supervillain sweat, right? And I think that's what's so fascinating. It might seem like peak Cold War, but it's also where we see the cracks in the Soviet Union really start to show.
Okay, so paint a picture for us. It's 1980.
Disco is on its way out.
Thank goodness. The U.S. is still dealing with that hostage crisis in Iran.
Yeah, a real low point.
And the Cold War, which had kind of been simmering, it suddenly kicks back into overdrive.
And a lot of that shift you can trace back to one event, the election of Ronald Reagan.
Because after years of trying to ease tensions, this guy comes in with a very different approach.
Completely. Here you have this staunch anti-communist, not afraid to call out the Soviet Union. In fact, he called them an evil empire.
Which, let's be honest, that's not exactly subtle diplomacy.
Not at all. But it was more than just words. Reagan ramps up defense spending, pushes for this whole strategic defense initiative.
Which, I mean, the media had a field day with that one.
Yeah.
Star Wars, they called it. Lasers in space.
Imagine pitching that in a budget meeting.
Right. Okay, hear me out. Lasers, space. It'll stop those pesky nukes. But seriously, this evil empire speech, our sources say it was a real turning point.
Absolutely. So it's 1983, Reagan's speaking to this group of evangelicals, and he just comes out swinging. The Soviet Union, he says, is the focus of evil in the modern world. And that's not just tough talk, it's framing the whole conflict in a very black and white way.
No more of that détente stuff. This was a line in the sand.
Totally. And it wasn't just speeches and weapons programs. Things are heating up around the world. This is where you have to understand the whole idea of proxy wars.
Okay, because for those of us who, well, weren't around back then, what exactly does that mean in this context?
Basically, it's a way for superpowers to fight each other without actually fighting each other directly.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So you've got places like Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola. The U.S. and the Soviet Union would be arming and supporting different sides, turning these regional conflicts into, well, proxy battlefields for their Cold War tensions.
So super high-stakes chess, but with real lives on the line. And meanwhile, you have the Soviet Union. They're dealing with their own problems, right?
Oh, yeah. This wasn't just external pressure from the U.S. Things were not good at home.
So the system's starting to break down.
Exactly. By the early 80s, the Soviet system's in trouble. The economy's a mess.
And not just a little messy.
No, a big mess. They're behind technologically. People are starting to lose faith in the whole communist system. It's just not working.
So the system's sputtering. And then cue the montage music.
Haha, yeah.
Because in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev takes over.
And it's not just a new leader, it's a whole different vibe, you know? Gorbachev represents a real break from the old guard. He knows how dire the situation is.
So no more stay the course. What does Gorbachev actually do?
He launches these two big reforms, Perestroika and Glasnost. Now, I know those words sound scary.
Yeah, they sound like something you order at a fancy Russian restaurant.
Right. But they basically mean restructuring and openness. He knows the Soviet system needs a total makeover economically, politically, the whole thing.
So Perestroika is about fixing the system, maybe even adding in some, like, free market ideas.
Exactly. And Glasnost is about transparency, you know, more freedom of speech, less censorship.
Trying to bring the Soviet Union into the modern world.
Yeah.
It's like he's trying to install the latest software on a computer from, like, the Stone Age.
And just like that old computer would probably crash, the Soviet Union is in for a wild ride. These reforms, they were meant to help, but they actually ended up revealing just how bad things really were.
And all of this is happening while Reagan's out there talking about the evil empire and, oh yeah, the nuclear arms race is still a thing. Talk about pressure. So we've got these two leaders, totally different worldviews, both facing huge challenges. What happens next?
Well, you'd think with all that going on, these two guys, Reagan and Gorbachev, would be headed straight for, like, a showdown.
Right. I mean, the stakes couldn't be higher, nukes and all that.
Exactly. But that's the thing about this period. It takes this really fascinating turn. Because both of them, even with their differences,
Which were huge.
huge, they both understood that, well, nuclear war wasn't really an option.
Yeah, mutually assured destruction tends to put things in perspective.
Right. And so there's this growing realization that maybe talking's not such a bad idea after all.
Easier said than done, though, I imagine. You've got decades of mistrust, propaganda.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't exactly buddy-buddy right off the bat. It starts with these high-stakes summits. And get this, they weren't just these stuffy diplomatic things. Our sources describe some really intense encounters. Like, they argued, they debated.
They were actually talking.
They were. And you know what else? Sometimes they even joked around with each other.
See, now I want to see that movie, the Reagan-Gorbachev buddy comedy. Two guys, nuclear codes, trying to save the world. Okay, but seriously, did they actually, like, get along?
Let's just say they developed a complicated relationship. Sometimes it was contentious, but they got things done. And one moment that really captures this whole dynamic, it's the Reykjavik summit in 1986.
Oh, yeah, this rings a bell.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the one where they almost agreed to abolish nuclear weapons completely?
You got it. They came so close. Think about that. A world with 0 nukes. It was actually on the table.
It's crazy to think how different things could be. Why didn't it happen? What went wrong?
They hit a snag. This big one, Reagan's Star Wars program.
The whole Strategic Defense Initiative thing.
Gorbachev saw as a way for the U.S. to kind of get the upper hand, not end the arms race.
So close. But even if they couldn't agree on total disarmament, didn't they make some progress, like baby steps away from the nuclear abyss?
Absolutely. 1987, they signed the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Catchy? What did it do?
This was huge. It actually eliminated an entire category of nuclear missiles, a concrete step toward, not destroying each other.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Diplomacy, actually working. But meanwhile, back in the USSR.
Ah, yes.
We talked about Gorbachev and his reforms, but how were those actually playing out?
Well, it was a mixed bag, to say the least. Remember that computer analogy, the whole trying to upgrade an ancient system thing?
Yeah, what happened? Did the Soviet Union get the blue screen of death?
Pretty much. It was this combination of economic chaos, things falling apart politically,
Yeah.
and a surge in nationalism. People within the Soviet republics are starting to demand more autonomy.
So while Gorbachev's trying to fix the roof, the foundation's crumbling, and then, boom, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls.
Iconic moment, right? But we can't forget, that didn't just come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of unrest, dissent building up in Eastern Europe.
So the wall coming down, that was more like a symptom, not the disease itself.
Exactly. It was, you could say, almost inevitable with everything else that was going on.
Okay, so what were some of the tremors leading up to that earthquake? What was happening in Eastern Europe that made the fall of the Berlin Wall almost, well, destined to happen?
Well, you had all this ferment happening throughout the 1980s, these movements gaining steam. Like in Poland, you have Solidarity.
Solidarity. I mean, even the name is powerful, right? Like this idea of collective resistance against, well, a system that seemed unbeatable at the time.
Exactly. And it's not just happening in Poland. You see protests, uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, even East Germany. That Iron Curtain, it's starting to come apart at the seams.
So how does Gorbachev react to all of this? I mean, this is the Soviet Union, right? The same Soviet Union that rolled tanks into Hungary in '56, into Czechoslovakia in '68. Surely they're not just going to sit back and watch this happen.
And that's the thing. That's what makes Gorbachev different. He breaks with that whole playbook. No tanks, no crackdowns.
Wow.
Yeah, he actually goes before the UN in 1988 and says, basically, the Soviet Union is done meddling in the affairs of these Eastern Bloc countries.
Talk about a foreign policy shift. No more Brezhnev doctrine, no more propping up these regimes with force. It's like unthinkable given their history. But this hands-off approach, didn't that just embolden the people who wanted to break away?
Oh, absolutely. It was a huge gamble on Gorbachev's part. The thinking was that reform, not repression, was the way to hold everything together. But as far as keeping the Soviet Union intact, well, that backfired.
So the pressure is building from all sides now, both inside and outside the Soviet Union. But it still takes a lot to topple a superpower. What finally does it? What's the straw that breaks the camel's back?
It all really comes to a head in August of '91.
Okay, hit us with it. What happens?
So you've got these hardline communists within the party. They are freaking out. Gorbachev's reforms, The Soviet Union potentially falling apart. It's too much.
They wanted to go back to the good old days.
Exactly. So they staged this coup, put Gorbachev under house arrest, try to take control.
Wow, a desperate, last-ditch effort to turn back the clock. Did they actually think they could pull it off?
It's hard to say if they really believed it or if it was just this, act of defiance as everything was changing around them. But one way or another, they completely misjudged the mood of the people.
What happens? Walk us through it.
The whole thing backfires spectacularly. People take to the streets. They're demanding Gorbachev's return. They're standing up to these coup leaders. It's incredible. Even people within the military, within the government, they refuse to support the coup.
It's amazing how quickly things can shift when those in power lose the support of the people, isn't it?
Right.
So the coup fails, Gorbachev comes back, but the Soviet Union's in a really precarious position now. How do we get from this point to the official dissolution in December of '91?
The failed coup, it was basically the beginning of the end. After that, it was clear that the central government in Moscow was losing its grip. And the republics within the Soviet Union, they saw an opportunity and they took it.
It's not just the Berlin Wall coming down, but the whole darn structure.
Exactly. And by December of 1991, the Soviet Union, the superpower that had shaped the entire world for decades, it was gone. 15 new countries emerged from the wreckage, all trying to figure out what came next. And that's how the Cold War ended. Not with a bang, but with this kind of drawn-out implosion.
Wow, what a wild ride. So you started this deep dive asking whether the 80s were just a prelude to the fall or a cause. What do you think?
I think it's pretty clear, after looking at all of this, that the 1980s were way more than just a prelude. It was a time of incredible pressure, both internal and external, that forced the Soviet system to confront its own failures. Reagan's tough stance, Gorbachev's attempts to reform the system, the fall of the Berlin Wall, that crazy coup attempt. These things weren't just random events, they were all connected, and they all played a role in bringing down the Soviet Union.
It's a good reminder that, well, history is rarely neat and tidy. It's complex, often messy. And sometimes it takes a whole bunch of seemingly unrelated things to create massive change. We're left with a lot to think about. How did everyday people experience this? What was it like to watch a superpower crumble in real time? What stories, what hopes and fears did they carry with them into this uncertain new world?
Such good questions. The human stories within all of this are just as important as the big events. And it reminds us that history isn't just dates and names. It's about real people living through these world-changing events.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. The end of the Cold War wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. A whole new world was born, full of both incredible promise and a whole lot of uncertainty. As you keep exploring, keep thinking about the ripples, how did it reshape everything? What changed? What new challenges emerged? Keep diving deeper. Keep asking questions.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.